Ah, yes, it's that magical time again where I look at yet another weird, obscure, and incredibly fascinating aircraft. Hello and welcome back. So, a little while ago, I announced that Flying Officer and Wing Commander tier Patreon supporters and YouTube members could now submit a video topic request, and I would then turn that into a small video. And I've already had a bunch of amazing suggestions, and today we are talking about one of them. We're looking at a lovely, bizarre plane designed by a lovely, bizarre man, and that is the Burnelli CBY-3 Loadmaster. Vincent Justice Burnelli was born on the 22nd of November 1895. He would have a passion for aviation from an early age, building his very first aircraft, the Burnelli Carrisi Pusher, in 1915 at the age of just 20. Following the end of the First World War, he continued his work, developing numerous aircraft concepts. He would eventually find employment in 1919 as the chief engineer of the Lawson Airplane Company. There, he helped to develop the Lawson L-2, a biplane airliner of which only one was built, and also the Lawson L-4, a more ambitious design which never actually made a successful flight. Burnelli wasn't the sole designer of these machines, and indeed that was probably the problem. He disagreed with the design philosophies being imposed by the company's founder, and because of this he would quickly move on. In 1920, he entered into business to form the Remington Burnelli Company, hoping to pursue the development of commercial aircraft on his own terms. In particular, Burnelli was somewhat obsessed with the concept of the lifting body, or lifting fuselage, style of aircraft. In traditional designs, the fuselage has a mostly symmetric, near-circular cross-section, allowing low drag for a large internal volume. Burnelli argued that this was a waste. Instead, if the fuselage had an airfoil section, like a wing, instead of being dead weight, it would contribute greatly towards the overall lift of the aircraft. Burnelli would spend pretty much his whole life trying to prove this concept, but unfortunately for him, it was a lifetime of frustration. Developing something new is often frustrating, because an aircraft like this is never just the result of one new invention or idea. It requires the successful development and combination of numerous concepts, systems, and materials. This includes aerofoils, engines, gearboxes, fuel systems, hydraulic systems, air screws, advanced alloys, and insulation materials. It then gets even more complicated when it comes to the more modern aircraft powered by gas turbine engines. Now, most of these things aren't especially challenging to develop by themselves, but remove any one of them and the aircraft stops being practical very quickly. That layered technological dependency applies to many things in our world today, and if you're interested in learning more about that, then I can heartily recommend the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization by Hungry Minds, who are very kindly sponsoring today's video. The book is a large, illustrated encyclopedia about the various technologies and practical knowledge that make civilization, well, work. Not just the grand and obvious stuff either, but also the smaller and subtler things that have allowed humanity to build upwards. Tools, materials, machines, science, design, medicine, agriculture, navigation, and all the other things that we tend to take for granted today until we suddenly imagine having to start everything all over again from scratch. It covers more than 180 topics across 23 chapters over 400 pages. But the thing that really stands out for me when it comes to this book is just how beautifully it presents the information that is contained within. It doesn't feel like a dry reference book. The artwork combines engineering-style diagrams with medieval-inspired illustrations, which give the whole book a very distinctive character. It feels part technical manual, part illuminated manuscript, and part what you would want on your shelf if civilization suddenly collapsed and everyone turned to you for answers. Which would be flattering if slightly inconvenient. It's also just a genuinely well-made object. It's printed on premium matte art paper with a laminated hardcover, and it looks absolutely gorgeous on a coffee table or a bookshelf. It's also nice and big. You know, if the world does end, you could essentially use this thing as an impromptu melee weapon as well as keeping it around as a useful tome. It's also a great gift for the curious sort of person who just likes history, science, design, and occasionally explaining obscure mechanical systems to people who didn't ask about it. There is even a hidden quest inside the book because apparently rebuilding civilization alone wasn't already enough of a project for this thing. So to grab yourself a copy, or to get a wonderful gift for a curious friend, click on the link in the description below and use the code REX and you will get 10% off your purchase. Right, back to Burnelli. In 1921, he built his first lifting fuselage design, which was the RB-1 biplane. Now yes, it does look a bit silly, much like somebody had enthusiastically smushed the fuselage with a rolling pin, and yes, this does set the tone for the aesthetics of future designs moving forward. Unfortunately, the RB-1 was crashed during testing after someone had incorrectly reconnected the tail control rods. The RB-1 would be followed, somewhat predictably, by the RB-2. This initial design would not have great commercial success, and unfortunately it was to be followed by decades of aircraft that amounted to one-off prototypes designed by an ever-changing set of companies bearing Burnelli's name, as he frequently changed business partners. This was for a couple of reasons, including various patent disputes, but that is sort of beyond the scope of this video, so I will leave them for a later discussion. Now, success almost came in 1934 with the Upper-Q Burnelli UB-14. This sleek and dramatic-looking monoplane was a much more promising design, but once again, Burnelli was frustrated by failure. The first prototype was wrecked, but the second one was good enough to secure interest from the Cunliffe Owen Aircraft Company in the United Kingdom. However, after producing just one copy under license as the OA-1, no further orders materialized. There was still some interest elsewhere though. The design was promising enough for the Canadian Car and Foundry Company, or CCF, to buy the rights to build the type. However, none of this specific design would actually be manufactured. CCF would propose an enlarged version of the UB-14 that was known as the CB-34, and had it flown, it would have been Burnelli's first trimotor design. But it didn't. A mock-up was built in 1937, but the outbreak of the Second World War meant that this civilian aircraft was put on indefinite hold as factories were being rapidly assigned to the mass production of Hawker Hurricane fighters. Despite this disappointment, the relationship between Canadian Car and Foundry and Burnelli did not end here though. Instead, it would give rise to the focus of today's video, the Cargo CBY-3 Loadmaster. This originated in 1943 when the airline company Transportes Aéreos Centroamericanos, or TACA, reached an agreement with CCF to produce 20 commercial transports. These would be built to TACA's specifications with input from another airliner, which was Transcontinental and Western. TACA wanted these new aircraft to serve on remote bush routes into Central and Southern America. It was to be a design based around mixed cargo and passenger facilities, with cargo placed in the front and passengers in the rear. It was expected that demand would lead to the plane mostly carrying cargo inland from coastal airports, and then a mix of cargo and passengers on the return journey. Burnelli, now at his newest firm, the Burnelli Aircraft Company, took these specifications, added his signature lifting body elements, and drew up the initial designs for what would be the CBY-3. A mock-up was constructed and wind tunnel tested by CCF, who fine-tuned the design, after which a prototype was approved for construction towards the end of 1943, early 1944. The airframe was built from stressed skin metal with fabric-covered control surfaces, supported by a traditional metal framework. Power was to be provided by a pair of Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engines, each delivering approximately 1200 horsepower. The fuselage was notably wide at 20 feet, and of course built of an airfoil section, with a length of 26 feet. The undercarriage was mounted to the fuselage and would retract upwards into it. This was handy as it would enable in-flight assessment and possible repairs to the gears, as well as allowing for manual extension in the event of an emergency. At its highest point, the fuselage was approximately 7 feet tall, which meant that the average person could stand quite comfortably at the thickest sections. Passengers were arranged in 4 rows with 2 aisles, giving either a capacity of 22 or 24 passengers. Sources do differ, and unfortunately there is a serious scarcity of technical drawings for this thing. Now, even with up to 24 passengers, this still allowed about 700 cubic feet to be dedicated to freight and cargo. This could be loaded through two large cargo doors on either side of the fuselage, allowing individual cargo items up to 20 feet long to be carried inside. Now, if more space was required, the passenger compartment section could easily be converted for storage as well, and this would give a total cargo capacity of just under 2,100 cubic feet. In terms of control, the tail surfaces were mounted on the end of a pair of deep twin booms. Now, even with the lifting fuselage, wings themselves were of course still needed. The 3-spar wings had a total span of 71 feet, with a total lifting area, including the fuselage, being 1,291 square feet. For comparison, the lifting area of the Douglas DC-3 was around 987 or 988 square feet. Records show that multiple iterations of the design were drafted up by Burnelli in the initial design phase, and it seems that one of the biggest challenges was the location of the cockpit. Naturally, it sat in the center, but because the engines protruded from the wings, it meant that sideways visibility was severely impeded. This was somewhat addressed by raising the cabin slightly upwards, but you could only do this by so much before you start severely impacting the aerodynamics. In the end, the design was finalized with the cockpit protruding as part of a sort of vaguely streamlined hump. Construction would start in December of 1943 at Montreal, but given the slight issue of this thing known as the Second World War still being in full swing, production was understandably slow. Experimental transport planes for export were always going to play second fiddle to warplanes. But with Burnelli excitedly looking forward to his first design set to enter service in 2-digit numbers, and with the war beginning to turn against the Axis, things were looking up. But, of course, Burnelli would be frustrated yet again. TACA would cancel their order for 20 planes before the first prototype was even completed. The exact reason for this change in heart is not entirely certain, but it is highly likely that it was linked to the fact that TACA acquired the single example of the UB-14 prototype for their operations and quickly found a whole slew of difficulties in operating it. Still, with the prototype already under construction, the project was seen through to its completion, and it was finished at the beginning of summer 1945. It made its first flight on the 17th of June, which lasted for an impressive 1 hour and 55 minutes, which indicated a good degree of confidence from the test pilots C. Pangborn and V. Hatton. And indeed, on paper the test results were quite good. Despite a very sedate maximum speed of only around 210 miles per hour at sea level, and a service ceiling of only 18,000 feet, it had a respectable range of 1,077 nautical miles, along with a notably short takeoff run for its size of just 650 feet. This was made all the more impressive given that its empty weight was 9,200 pounds, but fully laden it weighed in at 17,500. This gave it a carrying capacity which was a full ton greater than that of the Douglas DC-3. But if Burnelli had hoped that this would be the end of his frustrations, he was sorely mistaken. The prototype, being of a new and innovative nature, would give countless issues during the certification process. Indeed, testing brought with it so many challenges that the company's chief engineer, R.J. Moffat, simply referred to it as the bitch, a sentiment that was echoed by the rest of the engineering office. Notably, the aircraft outright failed the takeoff and controllability at store requirements for safety certification. Additionally, undercarriage drop tests were never even carried out, though the full reasons for which appear to be unknown. In an attempt to improve its low-speed responsiveness, it was re-engined with Pratt & Whitney twin Wasps, specifically the R2000-2SD13G, which produced approximately 1,450 to 1,480 horsepower. With these, it flew for the first time on the 10th of May 1946, but this was still insufficient for the stall tests, and the Loadmaster would never actually receive full certification. Instead, it was given a limited domestic certificate of airworthiness. This restricted its use to freight flights only, or demonstration flights, which meant it could take passengers, non-paying passengers, up to a limit of 10 people. No doubt unhappy with their foray into aircraft, Canadian Karr and Foundry would spin off a subsidiary to handle the aviation side of the business, and in 1947 the Can Cargo Aircraft Manufacturing Company was formed. Its first responsibility was to try to improve the CBY-3 design and hopefully manufacture it for some new customers. With its new company, the CBY-3 was renamed the Can Cargo Loadmaster 1, though it's also sometimes referred to as the Loadmaster Model 1 Cam 1. At this point, various adaptations were investigated to try and make the Loadmaster a bit more attractive to customers, and also, perhaps more importantly, to finally get the damn thing certified to fly passengers. One major redesign was proposed as the Loadmaster 2, which actually embraced the idea of throwing full passenger certification out the window and just building it as an all-freight transport from the outset. The proposed Loadmaster 4 was a variation on this theme, and was essentially an upgraded and enlarged version, with a reported estimated loaded weight of 30,000 pounds and featuring a tricycle landing gear. Apparently, there were also discussions about producing it as a seaplane or as an amphibian, but we couldn't verify this across multiple sources with certainty. There was a patent for a design similar to this from 1939, but we've been unable to find anything that links that to the designs that were being looked at by Can Cargo. While all these designs were being mulled over, the other major focus for the company, of course, was finding somebody to actually buy the damn thing. In March 1947, the Loadmaster began trials with Canadian Pacific Airlines as a freight transport. During these, it was operated from compacted snow runways around Quebec, delivering mining equipment between Mount Jolly, Seven Islands, and Knob Lake, which, along with such other places as the island of Dildo, puts Canada in strong competition with Australia, featuring such places as Yorkeys Knob, Titwobble Lane, and Mount Buggery for salacious nomenclature. However, crude giggling at location names aside, overall the trials were quite positive in their results, and the aircraft transported nearly 30 tons over a month, with the largest single payload being just under 7,000 pounds. But alas, this did not lead to any orders. Now, at around the same time as this, the United States Air Force was also showing some interest, and they eventually evaluated the Loadmaster in the summer of 1948. It was noted that the lifting fuselage made the type less sensitive to the effects of unbalanced loads on the center of gravity, but once again the design was rejected, this time for having limited overall utility. In particular, the Loadmaster was not well suited for high-density freight and vehicles, and the door size was too small for some military equipment to even fit. Furthermore, the lack of cabin heating, while common a decade earlier, was less acceptable in the new era of aviation following the end of the Second World War. In 1951, Can Cargo finally gave up their attempts to get the Loadmaster certified for passenger flights in Canada. Instead, on the 9th of February, it was sold to the Central Aircraft Corporation, Burnelli's latest company, in New York. There, it was re-engined to a pair of 1,700 horsepower Wright Cyclones in July of 1952. Finally, in July of 1955, the Loadmaster found a buyer. Well, a renter, really. The American Polar Basin Expedition chartered the Loadmaster for the first leg of its journey. On the 1st of May 1955, the Loadmaster flew the main expedition members and their equipment to Ellesmere Island, where they would board a ski plane to take them closer to the North Pole. 4 days later, on the 5th of May, the Loadmaster would make a second trip to ferry the expedition's sled dogs and their trainer to Ellesmere. It seemed that the aircraft was finally on the cusp of doing something vaguely more useful than hauling mining equipment, and possibly making a mark in history. Also, Burnelli had hoped. Just over 2 weeks later, on the 22nd of May, the expedition was forced to return, having never made it any further north than Goose Bay. Now, the cited cause for this is that defensive activities in the Arctic had created a fuel shortage, which was unsurprising as the Cold War was now in full blow, and the Arctic region is where many of the nuclear bombers of the Red and NATO air forces would need to fly over. A second expedition was planned for 1957, once tensions and military build-up had eased, but neither tensions nor oil prices dropped, and the second expedition never occurred. Still, desperately trying to find customers for more than just a charter flight for a failed expedition, Burnelli allowed the Loadmaster to be subjected to freighting trials down in Venezuela. This time it was rejected due to its poor takeoff performance. Now, this might initially seem odd, as short takeoffs and landings had been one of the Loadmaster's earlier strengths, but by this point the design was more than a decade and a half old, in a time when aviation technology was rapidly leaping ahead once again. In the same year, the US Army once again evaluated the Loadmaster, and this resulted in a wheels-up forced landing, because of course it did. I haven't been able to find any good photos of this, so let's just imagine how sad it must look. Thankfully, the broad fuselage did a good job of distributing the impact forces, and the aircraft survived the wheels-up landing with only minor damage. But the military were once again not impressed, and further interest in this type was dropped. Failing to attract further interest, and now steadily being left behind by its competitors, the Loadmaster would only make the occasional chartered freight journeys going forward. Its last paid flight was a 30-minute ferry flight from Beacon Field, outside Washington, to Friendship Airport in Baltimore. It landed on the 8th of December 1959, after which it was pretty much just abandoned, and it was left outside in the elements. However, people were not oblivious to the aircraft's uniqueness or rarity, and over the years, various efforts were made to try and save this aircraft from an ignoble end. For example, in April of 1960, the Ballard Aircraft Company investigated the idea of modernizing the design into the Loadmaster 2 and 3. That is the Loadmaster Roman numeral 2 and numeral 3, not to be confused with the Loadmaster Arabic numeral 2 and 3, because I guess confusing future historians is a favourite pastime for various designers over the years. The Ballard versions were meant to be powered by Allison T-37 turboprops, which would have certainly kicked the Loadmaster into the modern age. But as with so many of Burnelli's more adventurous escapades, this would come to nothing. The final twinkling of hope came in 1961, when the Canadian Department of Transportation investigated the idea of relicensing the Loadmaster in Canada to allow for paying passengers to use it once again, mostly for chartered sightseeing flights. However, because so much time had now passed, they were then informed that the certification process would have to start from the very beginning. This was a long and expensive proposition for a single aging airplane, and not one that was particularly economical anymore. After this, there appears to be no further record of official interest. The Loadmaster would never be a commercial success, and it would be the final aircraft designed by Burnelli that was actually built before his death in 1964. It was the closest he had come to proving his lifting body design, but fate had been unkind. By the 1970s, the rusting relic was the last surviving example of a Burnelli aircraft, and out in the open, its engines removed for salvage, it was steadily deteriorating at Friendship Airport as the years rolled by. But then, just as it seemed destined to be chucked into the scrap heap, the Burnelli aircraft was given a lifeline. It was purchased by the Connecticut Aeronautical Historical Association, who had it moved to the Bradley Air Museum between the 16th and the 20th of July 1973. There, a lengthy restoration was planned, but even in death, Burnelli seemed doomed to suffer even more frustration. In 1979, the museum, which had just moved to a new location, was struck by an F4 tornado, which caused significant damage to the CBY-3, destroyed multiple other aircraft, and almost shut the museum down for good. But aircraft restorers are nothing if not amazing and persistent people, and although it took a while, decades in fact, The restoration work resumed and was eventually completed. To mark the high point of the aircraft's checkered career, it was restored to the same standard and paint scheme that it had had for the polar expedition. Today, looking just as it did during its prime, it is on display at the New England Air Museum, where hopefully it avoids any further tornadoes. Burnelli was a man with a vision. A vision of an aircraft where the fuselage itself would provide lift to match with the wings. An efficient aircraft, capable of lifting great loads for its size and taking off in a remarkably short distance. The CBY-3 Loadmaster was, in many ways, this aircraft. It was his crowning achievement, but one that sadly the world did not want. Its oddities put off customers in a world of post-war civilian aviation that wanted proven concepts, not risks, and before long it was left well behind by the scores of aircraft now being powered by the gas turbine engine. However, his ideas are not without merit, and some of his other concepts were truly fascinating. So in the not-too-distant future, I'll be exploring Burnelli's other interesting designs, and the man himself in a bit more detail. But that, dear viewers, is a story for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you of course to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help keep this channel going. And a special thank you of course to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members, and a warm welcome to Clintock, Michael, and Michael, who are the newest members of this special group. Okay, so that is another supporter chosen topic completed. Thank you Firestar for suggesting it. I've now received over 20 submissions so far, but I am hungry for more, so if you've got an inkling for a particular topic to be covered, please feel free to fill in the form if you are a Flying Officer or Wing Commander tier member. The links are on Patreon or on a pinned post in the YouTube members section. If you can't find the link, just flick me a message. But that is all for today. Once again, thank you all so much for your continued patience and support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.